Good.
Tashi Dele Gen Rinpoche, thank you so much for these precious teachings. And good morning, Katrina, our wonderful translator. And welcome to everyone online. We're happy that you're joining us this morning. And we'll begin with some prayers. You'll find the link for the prayers in the chat box. To the teacher and now transcendent destroyer, the one that's gone, the foe destroyer, completely and fully awakened one, perfect in knowledge and good conduct, one gone to bliss, nor the world's supreme guide to beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and humans to you, the Buddha and Tao, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni, and prostrate, make offerings and go for refuge. Widow supreme among humans, you were born on this earth, you paid 7 strides and set act supreme in this world. To you who are wise and I bow, with your bodies formed supremely fine, wisdom ocean like a golden mountain, fame that blazes in the 3 worlds, winner the best, supreme guide, to you I bow. With a supreme science, face like a spotless moon, color like gold, to you I bow. You are immaculate, the 3 worlds are not, incomparable wise one, to you I bow. Great compassionate protector, all-knowing teacher, field of merit and good qualities, vast as an ocean, to the Tathagata I bow. Through purity, freeing from attachment, through virtue, freeing from the lower realms, unique, supreme, ultimate reality, to the Dharma that is peace I bow. Having freed themselves, showing the path to freedom too, well established in the trainings, the holy field endowed with good qualities, to the Sangha I bow. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind completely, this is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, a mirage, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop, a dew, a bubble. A dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud, see conditioned things as such. Through this merit may sentient beings attain the state of all seeing, subdue the foe of false, and be delivered from the ocean of cyclic existence, perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. This ground anointed with perfume, flowers strewn Mount Meru, foreland, sun and moon, imagined as a Buddha land and offered to you, may all beings enjoy this pure land. Venerable holy gurus, in the space of your truth body, from billowing clouds of your wisdom and love, let fall the rain of the profound and extensive Dharma, in whatever form is suitable for subduing sentient beings. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create, by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create, by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create, by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings.
那 Dick 送给了。
가려고 관계 치는 명도 럽제시 모두 처럼 탐지 럽점데 대단 제베 뒤에 럽되네 자주 청이들로 샤서로 어야다 천년 뒤끌로 지역가 내시다 남비내시라 전에 다른 거죠 최주배 천지 탐지서로 개인 탐지다 제 아니 산재 때마다 제 랑게 삼다나 지랑도시 내 탐지 시대 네버 예배 깎내려야 아니 요 대치부터달고 센치차네 요 네버 강가 천디터달 소치고 많이 봐 천디 지다리야 콜로 가시 지그래 봐도 땡땡땡게 말아 요 치마 편제 요리 뭐인데 치마 편제 뒤에 준비 뒤돌에 삼다고 봐인데 대체도 요 치마 함미고 봐 최주배 때단도 들어와치 개발시지 토벌시하고 대체도 내성의 교학관에 함미고만 토벌 그 시알라 체외 미교와 주파 템베 소교발라서 교와 주주데 그러와 아니 단조지 멜리지 토벌시하냐면 최주배 때 개발시지 교환의 교와 주도 토벌시하냐면 그런 지시하고도 와 야 뒤질라면
So here, beginning with an homage to the Buddha, he who has knowledge of all phenomena and destroys the kind of wrong thoughts of all tirthakas, this supreme among two-footed beings, to him I bow down. So here, as always, we should set a proper motivation for listening to the Dharma. Again, making sure that our thoughts are towards something larger than just this life. If we could get to the state wherein we have the knowledge of all it is that we should adopt and all it is that we should avoid, here we have that kind of potential or that sort of ability in this life. And so we shouldn't use that ability for solely the affairs of this life alone. This life is really, when we think about it, a very short period of time. And so we shouldn't let ourselves just waste our efforts in the affairs of this life alone, but rather think long term, think lifetime after lifetime. And in order to be able to fully benefit other sentient beings, we're striving for this state wherein we have that kind of perfect knowledge of all that we should adopt and all that we should avoid. And so in order to be able to get there, though, we need to ensure that we have a good life after a good life. We need to have the kind of conditions like we have now of having this precious human rebirth and having met the Dharma and so forth. And so in order to ensure that we gain such a good rebirth again in the future, for that purpose, we initially, importantly, avoid those kinds of actions, the 10 non-virtues, killing and so forth, that are harmful actions, and instead make efforts towards engaging in beneficial actions, protecting life and so forth, in order to ensure that at the very least we have another good rebirth in the future. Disons.
대외 교화실에 대인하고 동해 말도 대인도 밀리 최주배 때 개발자만 뭐더 버전에 아니 다르도 돼 대화 탐제된 데마 땐도 대화 더 버시자고 대인데 하다 밀려야 동해 마부 고하러 와 고라서도 콜레다 념을 배워게 시험하도 전에 기치 찍네 지도 고라인데 동해지라 시체 단다고 내가 념을 시험하기 좋네 풍부 노래 제고 같으셔도 동해지라 시체 배틀했던도 타바시고서 대체도 대교가에서나 나오 네 나초 건조세라 뭐볼래 잡다 나초 삼사티마도 삼지매게 삼로 숙셔서 오르와 전다 다지 생활지시 나인지 봐서 대왕계니 저당 삼을게 Kiwangi lesane, ke lesasuna ni lada mele, ki mikwe lesana, miensoli kiwiyorwa. Ki du tekyu, dadun zimbala soba nyama bachineja, bambachawi insam. Te chidu tsendile ko ngada ngayi samsa, nganzu konzu sosa chakdangi samla, konzu ngaji chakdawla soba, nyiri misinala chunga chene, tarwa toba chichawi insam, tende samli chikokudowa. Oh yeah.
So here, though, again, if in the future we gain a rebirth as a human or a god, that is something that is still in the nature of suffering. Compared to a rebirth in the lower realms, it's better, it seems happier, but it's not really beyond the nature of suffering. And so the thought arises, I need to gain a definite freedom, as long as I am still in samsara, and samsara being this cycle of uncontrolled rebirth due to our karma and afflictions. This cycle of taking up various aggregates and casting them off. We want to get out of this situation where we are totally controlled by our karma and afflictions. And so examining this, we see that it is really has as its root this thought of I and this thought of mine. We grasp at this as like our side, and then there's an other. And due to that, we give rise to attachment to our own side and aversion, sort of hatred for the other. And due to that, we engage in various actions, particularly negative actions that lead us into the lower realms. And so recognizing that it is based upon this self-grasping, this strong self-grasping attitude that we then give rise to all of the other various afflictions, we strive then on a day-to-day basis to reduce those, to get rid of those, the things that cause our renewed rebirth in samsara. So on a day-to-day basis, we try to eliminate our various afflictions of attachment and aversion and jealousy and pride and anger and so forth, in order to strive toward that state of liberation, of freedom from this uncontrolled cycle of rebirth. Dixon.
Oh yeah. Oh, tene te chelia, rajibu, tene tongele tendo tarwa, te samji samlutani, te chidu bena, marabre samgutwa, soso chendi mada pamanyenjele soba, ragi, rala kadi chimusine medu, jawa chimbu yogi, te kanga, samluchi mada che, soso chibu tongele tendo tawe samlutana, marabre sam, chendi pame chumbe, Nyendi sama rāla kati chibu yinpata. Kiwa kanti lāna ko shen chiso chili teni, tetan triyani ko mesi tsogu yora. Tindin kebar che sikdwa nganzo. Tindin kebar che samil tandu sa, chindi pama nyendi la sobada yinda yin. Ti mayingi chiso korante, chiwi chili roba che tengri samil kogudwa. Lamga songa yore, soso pengi yore, kangba te chocho yore. Saya toya kanga te chigore, chigi, gogu kang tengichi, goya te chub tengichi. Kende tezo chizo le tene soso, sugi yore sam, sendile ina chizo sama, lamga songa le soba, kanga jamga le soba, nganzi chichi le roba chingi re sha sam. Kende kiwa le changmeba sonza, soso pama ta nyende, pudan pamula soba roba, nangmi le soba, tana rala lobden chingi kigen le soba. Tende majuba chi yamandu sam, kichi pene ngoma shimba mato chige. Tende simjen de rala ten chimbu re, de ten chimbu ma re. De tsen de pama na shing ten chimbu re. De ma re se achi ko, iwa chi achi mengere te ordo. Rangi ten mato, ngoma shimba to chige. Tende simjen tamje, tsen de pama dan drave ten chimbu shachi re sha samne. Marshi tende sita nga zunam biyo shege ba. O tende tene chiba tone. Te tamze tunga da trawe tabla mambe sosu chibu tarwa samutana marab resha sam. Tende chi samla ko. Chenya rala kade chema chi samla mare. Simje sama de rana shi tawan de la tunga mende ba tanya re sam. O te inde rangi tunga de sego tuwa tuken sunza sego yora. Tewa de chugu yora, tewa sunza chugu yora. Tete simje shen nga zu tong denge tuzu tunga de tunga re. Sero che ure sam ral nebe na. Dewa de churo che ure chunju na lingwe wa. Tume yin che te se cha as. O ti de ko. Tende samlu tane. 단답하다 소수치부 삼다라 제버리즈무 삼다 데이터도 삼다다네 겨 통만되는 삼다리데 라게 치슈치네 라야슈 켈레비오 마라 다들 삼을도 너르샤 사라 다들 셰게 치슈치고 샤삼 다 삼을 거란 지부자야를 샤사라 통만되는 라게 치슈치가 삼을 파샤 다 셰게 치슈치기나 통만 당부된 간 삼을 들으시 코네 따져 상제 사람마다 셴다 켄도 삼도 삼되어라 다 삼을 거란 너르샤삼 셴지 동에 비치를 대삼 교생도 삼을다 그din 쳬다 마치든데 삼을 막고 내라 셴지 동에 대해서 그래서 저와도 주로 제고 그래서 라장장 삼을마다 셴지 번째 맞다 제고라 라진제다 셴지 번째 물론이 고사치에서 근데 다음에 셴지에 자주 셈스러워 셴된 것이 두 배에서 셴지 된다데 랑게 된다 삼다 다다 좋아 어디데 셴심제 탐지게 된다려 통만 매번에 랑게 시슈치데 마샤삼 대교 감가 조셔서 다 셴게 시슈치네 삼을 거로 집자기 있음 어디인데 먼저 산제다 자주 삼번 남게 셴지 버지 라예완도네 단다 산제지 고반토로 어디나 시다가 치겠어 단다 섬제 탐지게 된다 산제지 고반토 섬제 탐지게 된다고 해도 섬제 탐지 동해를 땐도 타야 대화 탐지는 거에 그니베 네가 연계게 탑 답에 셴지게 자주 셈 시럽 동반이라서 봐 랑도지 내 탐지 시베 산제지 고반지 토바리 자기 삼 타체 다른 분 이름 무삼다 대체도 아니 담배철에 태바다 삼바고 마치기 삼 고노세 담네 삼바쇼스 다른 분 마치나라 되지라면 그래 내 마음도 쳐서
So Geshe-la is saying that he's said too much, but it's important to translate. So here, if we are to think of just ourself alone, if we're making effort just for our own kind of definite freedom, that's really not suitable. It's not right, considering the fact that if we are to think nothing of others, we are really like ignorant of the fact of the incredible kindness that they have shown us, not just in terms of like our mothers and our fathers, our friends, even our teachers in this life, those people who have shown us very great kindness, but also we only survive and exist in a society due to other sentient beings. We live and exist in dependence upon other sentient beings. So, for example, the ones that build our roads, that build our houses, that grow our food, and so forth, we can't exist without other sentient beings. And so here we should recognize the fact that the kinds of beings, like, for example, our mother and our father, our dear friends who have shown us great kindness, other than not recognizing it, we have taken countless rebirths in the past. And so there's not a single being that we can point to and say, oh, they haven't acted in that kind of position as my dear mother or father, my friend, my teacher, whoever it may be that we see as having given us the greatest kindness. And so recognizing this, recognizing all sentient beings as our mother, as it's called, we learn not to make distinctions between them. Other than not recognizing it, all sentient beings have acted in that capacity, showing us such great kindness. So in this way, we train our minds to recognize the kindness of all sentient beings and wish to repay that kindness and so forth. There's also the method of thinking that just in the way that we don't want to suffer and we want to have happiness, that is the same for all sentient beings. There's really no distinction between us. And as Shantideva says in the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, because it's suffering, it's something to be eliminated. Because it's happiness, it's something to be achieved. We should learn to see the kind of happiness and suffering of others as something worth trying to achieve their happiness and eliminate their suffering. And so when we think about what has led us to the kind of current situation that we are in, it's really our self-cherishing attitude. All of the kind of faults and difficulties that we experience, the fact that we are not a Buddha, is really due to our having followed after our self-cherishing attitude. And if we could learn to see the kind of faults of this this self-cherishing attitude and really see the benefits of an attitude of cherishing others and come to exchange those attitudes, sort of disregard ourselves in the way that we normally disregard others, and instead cherish others in the way that we usually cherish ourselves. That is the kind of way in which we can develop this attitude of bodhicitta that cherishes others. This is the path that Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the past have traversed. And so to recognize that since beginningless time, all of the various faults, all of the kind of difficulties that we encounter come from following after this self-cherishing attitude. And in contrast, all of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the past have been able to, through exchanging, equalizing, and then exchanging this attitude of self-cherishing with cherishing of others, they have attained this really high state. So we should give rise to this thought, again, thinking very long term. This isn't a single lifetime kind of thing, that in order to attain the welfare of all sentient beings, in order to bring about their definite happiness, I'm going to train in the method side of the kind of attitude of bodhicitta based upon equalizing and exchanging self and others, and also develop the sort of wisdom that understands phenomena as they are in order to be able to attain such a state in which I can affect the welfare of all sentient beings. So thinking long term in this way, we should set our kind of motivation for listening to the Dharma.
Oh yeah, sorry. Oh, 당아주 대일에서 그래서 기분 좋게 살아를 신바. 다이나들 박배 temba 시부 동해다 군주랑 고바다 남대 자실이 셰도 세트 조사서 다이나 temba 시디 럽스럽스 질람나 마도 되지 말사. 산지 좀 된다 와르나서 편에네 최당 무송으로 되네 동해 박배 temba 되네 군주 박배 temba 되네 고바 박배 temba 되네 람 박배 temba 오세. 대손도 가르쳐 거였으나 되네 예수도 자타던다 말아줘. 대사가 네 잠불인데로 네 리소소소리 농제 세고 내면을 속아서야 또 강발을 속도서 강가서 거라 동해 바베테 뭐 바바 남지 가사가 시든지 정말 동해 들어시 저도 시기어를 송거라 가라지고 대로 시도시 저 통교라 소교라 듣고 삼을 체르도 맞잖아 하고 요마를 맞도 니 정말 동해라 시체에서 계속도 그 옛날에 동해된 바서 거라 되네 군주 바베테 바오서도 안데 정말 교환자매자 내진직된자매자 련자매자 데서 정말데 고해서라 고해 교환자매자 내리론절을 써본데서 컨텍스트니 좋아했었나 지금 제바볼을 써봐 현대적인 성견다 되네 삼루탄지 성견수요 말해서 되네 군주 바베테 바오서 라라가 심전치다 소소 게르다 된데고게 교환만 남서 레서네 군주 템바스데 냐모다 냐모고 안게 사벨레 데레 군주 템바스고라 레다 냐모니로 군주 템바스고도 저 교환만 남서 심전라한다 치소님 사샤베 냐모 레 냐모다 냐모고 안게 사베 레드레스 당당아 나이 맞아 삼 자당한 삼을 코에네 레 교미게 사교라 어디 군주리 때 교디테레세 송구도 야티질라나.
So picking up in the text, and this is on page 88 in the English, we had just finished with the essential teachings for the middle, the teachings of the definite goodness of liberation. And so here it said at the end, what is the foremost teaching that they explain in detail? It is the Four Noble Truths, true sufferings, true origins, true cessations, and true paths. And so before moving on, I think it's important to just give a little context or a discussion of the Four Noble Truths. So the Buddha advised Varanasi taught the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, in which he explained this is the truth of suffering. This is the truth of the origin of suffering. This is the truth of the cessation of suffering. And this is the truth of the path. And so when we think about like our this world, the kind of abode that we are in, our own body, the various things that we enjoy and use, these are in the nature of suffering. For noble beings or for superior beings who have come to see reality as it is, they see this as in the nature of suffering. Again, the external world, our enjoyments, our body even. Whereas we see this as something that is like a source of pleasure. But when you come to a level of realization, you come to see that this is actually within the nature of suffering. And then the Buddha taught the truth of the origin of suffering. So again, our container world, the kind of abode that we live in, our body, our various enjoyments, no sort of God created that. There's not a maker outside of ourselves, but rather it is due to our own sort of individual and collective karma that all of this is established. In particular, this all arises from karma and the afflictions, and really the afflictions being the primary driver of our engaging in karma, particularly this thought of I and mine, and then attachment to our own side and aversion toward others. Due to this, all of these various things come about. So the truth of the origin of suffering establishes that karma and the afflictions are the cause that lead to this truth of suffering.
Oh yeah. Dini kunjung babe temba dindi so. Dini ngokpa babe temba was ta tanda di dunge temba da kunju temba ni de sundu koa ge judan jebu ni de son so. Koa se re sindi koe neli lonje de dunge ran shi chen re. Di judi kare ne le da nyama ba. Di re che kunju temba di judi son ra. Koa koe den di re. Di dunge ran shi chen re. Di judi di re son so. koe chunde ni sora. Ta tenen gogba baba tembo shane tenen koe jude mebe soya yorbe tele thare yorbe samla korwa. O tele thare yor tas tunga de mebe soya yore sungara. Tenen gogba baba tembo os. Nyomun gogba. Nga sam ganjista chagdanda ro. Chagdanga wangi le sa chene kwa ku yora. Chachate Nyamu gogba yores, Nyamu seba yores, Nyamu pangba yores, then gogba pabe temba osidu, gogdendi sumutwa, Nyamu pangba. Tanda Nyamu seba, ya tarba, karisna oti yores sumutwa. Aneti tungele tendu tarwa, oh, tandi tungele tarwa sede, nega bwe, mi samlo tanda tunge mabu changa ranzi choge samlo kondro nga je chadon rensi tende yungu towa shenla chowa chene. Tende ko nega bwe tunge tsu mewa soya de samlo tanda wa chene, choge samlo tanda wa chene. Tunge mabu chi mewa chi chiso de yago che ko dewa je soto ya che sungu towa. Ta tatu tendu tunge le taya kyudela ote, tendu tunge le taya yo rese. Te kyudi ka rese na. Dine lamba betemba os, toye yor, tarba yona, tarba de toye tapshi yor besa, o tapshi yor das. Dine lamba betemba os, karesne, koa kore ki kyu so de, nga samsa nga rawa, nga yi sam nga yi rawa, nga zo sera, konzo sera, chawdang la soba, tele tene koa ko yores. Nga o nyambe nganzu di pangi ina, 아니 나도 건조세 차당 녀모 센도라 차당 녀모 센 아니 차당 거기 레사고 말어 차당 거기 레 마사나 거 거지 주요 말해 아니 다르바다 탐제 쳔바도야기 레사고 여마도 거 거지 레 주요 말어 근데 되네 람바베 템보 오 람가 요르다세 다네 바 콤벨람 이러 아니 파랑야라 께라 소바틀레 마부요도 저저데 다네 바 콤벨람 나오 냠베 당신들이 싸워지는 녀목하고 깨운 거라 싸워도 매버서는 생각하고 매버사도라 뒤도 나 라오에 나 매봐 라오에 다 매봐 다음에 또 봐. 라오에 나 이와 매봐 뒤또 봐 람데 동반이 도발람데 타르마데 토지게 남가 요래 뒤에서부터 어디지라면
So here in this first turning of the wheel, the Buddha taught this is the truth of suffering, and this is the origin of suffering. And then he taught the truth of cessation. So the first two, the truth of suffering, again referring to all of this kind of world, the beings within it, and so forth, is and that there is an origin to that suffering in our karma and afflictions. This describes the cause and result process by which we experience the sufferings of samsara. So, having identified that all of samsara is in the nature of suffering, the Buddha then gave us what are the causes that lead toward that, our karma and afflictions. And then the question arises, well, is there an ability to get out of that? And the Buddha taught that yes, there is a possibility, there is freedom from that. If we eliminate our afflictions, there is a cessation of the afflictions. And that kind of cessation of the cause will lead to a cessation of the resultant suffering. So here, this is teaching that there is an elimination, an extinction, a cessation of our afflictions that leads to a definite kind of a freedom wherein we will no longer experience sufferings. So there are times when we use the Dharma in ways to, say, work with our various afflictions in order to pacify the kind of sufferings that they are bringing about for us. And so that's kind of a temporary solution. We can use a different way of thinking in order to eliminate our suffering. But there is also a way to achieve a kind of definite freedom. There is a method to bring that about, which refers to then the truth of the path. So here, the main cause that leads us to this cycle of repeated rebirth within samsara is holding to a sense of an I, like an I and a mine, and this I as being like autonomously or independently existent. And due to that, we then engage in various afflictions. We have attachment and aversion and so forth, and accumulate karmas. And so, if we are able to extinguish those afflictions, get rid of that fundamental cause, then we will no longer continue to accumulate karma and thereby end this cycle of repeated rebirth. So, this is taught in the truth of the path, in terms of like the Eightfold Noble Path and so forth, and really the ultimate antidote that is getting at that fundamental cause of our cycling in samsara, to understand the selflessness of persons and phenomena, that there is no such independent, autonomous self as we understand it to be. That realization of selflessness, that path realizing emptiness, is the means by which we are able to achieve such a definite, irreversible cessation of the suffering that results from our afflictions, and particularly that grasping at some kind of an autonomous I.
뭐야 다 되지잖아 어디는 말아줘 가서래 동해 날에 깨 동해 개바다 나와다 치월어서 봐 리지 동해 망부쳐야 해와도 어떠서 됐다고 내가 그런가 고소해요 말고 과 코르세도자 용우 되기라 때 마행에 동해 망쳐 샘기 삼을 딴다 전에 용구하라 샘기 삼을 딴다 만들어서 소소소소 소셔봐 지도 고랑 소셔봐 지기질은 아주 자도 앉아서 서버만 공부처로 잠배선 매버 째배선 매버 현대 건가 사또나시 삼다 라디시 삼다 아니 소소 미집세 미집세 망쳐지는 거는 샘비통에 망쳐도 소소 남도 삼을 땅다 소도 디마뉴르 땅에들 서버 공에다 잠바다 저와다 로아 테니스 텐데 삼을 땅에 최고 삼을 손에 매버 소야지 그 송교라 내가 메시지 매버 소야들도 자 그때 막 동해 류다 그래서 동해도 좀 초로 나는도 와 그거랑 시리 강가 연주에서 당분에 삼을 날 구제이나 정말 연도 다 대랑 시리 제가 요마를 삼사 söt고요라 남규 삼을 제마다 톱잡고 저기 와서 다들 쉬우지 미세베르지 매어를 쉬우지 조사하니 뺏음게 요구하다 제가 그 동해 리를 비슷한데 리소에도 동해 싸워내 매어서야 된다 라와 마음보나 거의 기시규네 랑 풍부실랑 동해 영향시 된데 시험을 했던데 동해 싸워내 매어서야 돼 녀목 사와디 당시에 대동반이 공부를 나서도 15지 연하셔기 와라. 뒤질럼 되냐 맞았어요.
Mm. So here, in terms of the various kind of sufferings that we experience the sufferings of birth and aging and sickness and death. So because we are in samsara, we are going to experience those kinds of suffering. This is in the nature of suffering, our current situation. However, many of our sufferings are created through our wrong ways of thinking. We create so much mental suffering due to our improper kind of thinking. When we disregard others, when we don't think of them as even having feelings or experiencing suffering or happiness, and we just sort of have pride and jealousy and arrogance and anger and so forth, we create a lot of suffering just due to that kind of improper thinking. And so we can engage in a practice of Dharma by trying to eliminate that sort of improper discursive thought in order to reduce the kind of sufferings that we create for ourselves through that kind of conceptual thinking. However, and this in turn will reduce the suffering that we experience in terms of body and mind. We're able to, if we recognize, you know what, this is just the way that samsara is. It is in the nature of suffering. We are better able to bear with that, to have patience with that. But if we are interested in extricating from the very root, the source of all of our sufferings, then we need to engage in the kind of wisdom that understands that this grasping at a self, grasping at some kind of an autonomous self, being that that is the root of all of our sufferings, we try to develop an understanding of selflessness, of a lack of such a self, which is able to, again, remove that root cause of all of our sufferings.
뭐야? 또 먼저 뒤에 단다 다음에 봐서 돼. 동해 자원에 매봐서야 되다 다음에 공부도 와. 뒤에 단남기는 마무셔야 되더라. 내가 저 삼로 날 가르쳐도 나 삼삼을 거대. 나한테 랑원데 집에 삼을 거도. 저쪽에서 얘기를 했지. 거기에 나리나 가봐야네 실 남기시가. 아주 건조해서 자리 잡고 가시게. 나 바바이네 나도 가서 방걸 주고 저 답글이 방걸 나나인다 체 가시 도와지 치시라고도 지연하셔도 라고 지연하셔도 당원에서는 그 풍부가 처음 들려 명지 따셔라 제치다시인다 등주인다 세라네 내가 뜻이 등주인사서 전제 대거를 맞도 지금 로가지 풍부한테 파시한 로가지 주주석에요 말아 라오에 다시라더라 라와 풍부를 떼내려 그냥 알아서 미치로 미래치네 소소소부지 통서는 거래서 통서는 뒤치지래도 와서 비트시래샤 든두래샤 팔로 따기도 와 소불을 떼내 파따기도 와 근데 소소럽지네 소소 초와 대화다 동해다 든두 삼로다 다들이 조금만 지지 마소삼 콘두세는 콘두를 떼내 더 공야부들 무슨 하고 질러고서 파따기어라 로 따고 대sam으로 마도 라와치 나저 삼을 땅나시 나 라와치네 티카와여서 째네 라에 예서를 죽고도 따서봐 째서봐 초토와 나랑 여다서 소리치 소보다 샘다 소안 두시 파샤다 텔로로스 예서를 죽고도 풍불이 대신 베타서라 치르바이니 이때 여서라 망쳐도 요하다 풍불이 대신 베타 예서라 풍부 소보 스틸라가레 코나 다데 뒤나로 때 나기 따서로 치 따서로 라와티도 샤기도 어디인데 근데 다시 연하셔가 티요 말어 샬라 라마레 병어랑시디 때매반에 다음에 봤어도 시계변할 때 요방한테 너무 바발레 수반나시 되게 라와 매바데 때나 다네 요 많이 해서도 라와에 다디요 말에서 최탐자 다음에서 최탐자를 라와도 주가게요 말에 망부질을 때 많이게 망부질을 소원에 발레 바지 다네 니치지 니캉바렌 니치지를 샤고를 만들지 찍을 라와도 주가 강바스가 수투에지요 말도 컴퓨터리네라 남주이네라 가리네 뭐 강같이 버리다 다음에 해야 돼 최탐자 라와에 당니도 매버들 다음에 봐서 그래 tanda umatan jochana. Because wrong about the Tantani of my Isungdo. Till in the trouble, living the trouble, and Jivachati. Till a Taji Chaw and the consumer and the Shana Rama living more than she did so. Ta me say ta the Karis Tangi, Shana Rama leve Tangi, more. This so that Roja Kangal Sayora. Ta me bas Rango, Rang Tangi me bas Chayara. Tela tacha wana kanshin gobu namji shen la ra ma lebe ngochi. Shen dakshi la tene le fa takwa samla ra ma lebe se kona chi yo na chi su shek ra tra yi ne ku yu ngo ne tra ne fa chen ge chus. Yi do wa yi ne yu ngo ne su chi yo basar. So su sem ki pa ta ni chi ma yi ge chi tong ne tel pa ta sha ba samro chi me do wa. O ti indi ko. Ti ya chi tsunga pa we shen la ra ma lebe se tunda di kare se na. Rồi, Kyujin Shen la ra ma le bala sao mai, stine le la sa do ra. Kyudan Kin Shen la ra le bit kanga ha ko ra. Kyujin Shen la ra ma le bala sao ma res. Tanyen do go lo de la Shen si res. Dakshi le tene chashe chi tonen de chi ji inda spa tangen ge lo chi do wa. Ming da dai tanyen si ra. Le pa tangen ge tanyen be lo te ya Shen si res. Tanyen be lo wang ge shakba ma yin ba. Sashe mayinge kashe chilten palo de dires pa ming ta sharwa. Tesam bi yeba tsodo re ta yinda ti tsodo go kainda taga tsor mada. Tesam bi shagwa mayimba yu korang ne chi zu zu sa chi dires che ten yeba chi yo mara. Tani belo le shensel te wange shagwa mimbe yeba la ne rawa e tani tu yeba asigora. O de ji labda ta mangda to che so ya.
So here, then, when it comes to this understanding of selflessness, to get rid of the kind of suffering from its very root, we need to then get rid of that grasping at an I, that sense of there being some kind of like autonomous, independent I, as if there were something that we could point to, either within our aggregates or outside the aggregates, that like exists from its own side without depending upon anything else. Like when we think of someone like, oh, that's Tashi, or oh, that's Tundrup, we see we have this sense that there's like a thing there that we could point to and say that is the person. Like say when we see someone's form in the distance, we're like, oh yeah, there's Tashi over there, and we think that there's like a person that exists from their own side. But rather, it's the case that we really are only designating something on a collection of various aggregates. So it is on the basis of this collection of aggregates, like we're feeling sad and we say, I'm sad, or I'm hungry, or I'm this. It is on the basis of those aggregates that we designate such a self. But it appears to us as though there was something like autonomous, independent, that could bear scrutiny, that could stand up to analysis, that we could point to and we could say, that's it right there. And so most non-Buddhist schools assert that there is such a self that exists in that way, something like either permanent or something enduring or something even outside of the aggregates that we can point to and say, yes, that is the self. But according to Buddhists, and particularly the Prasangikas, there is no such self. So here I believe the quotations are earlier in this text, and if I don't get them exactly correct, I'm sorry about that. Aryadeva has in his 400 verses explained that when we refer to selflessness, this means the lack of any sort of essential, autonomous, independent kind of a self. And so whether we are talking about something like the person or any sort of external phenomena, a house, a plane, a computer, whatever it is, that thing is merely designated upon a collection of various parts. There is no such like autonomous, independent, objectively existent thing that exists from its own side. So here, Chandrakirti, in commenting on Aryadeva's verse from the 400, states that the self, when we talk about a self, as in things, phenomena, and persons are selfless, this is referring to the lack of such an autonomous, independent kind of a self that isn't dependent upon anything else. So now, normally in our life, we don't have that sort of a sense. It's not as though we are going around thinking, oh, I'm just something that's merely designated on the basis of these aggregates, but rather we have this sense that there is this like solid, real thing, this self that exists autonomously or is set up from its own side. And so here, when we are looking at this as well, Lama Tsongkhapa has indicated that it isn't just the sense of there not being, or sorry, that selflessness is referring to something being dependent upon causes and conditions. It's not just that we have a sense of there being a self that is somehow not dependent upon causes and conditions, but it's also the sense of autonomous in terms of our not being aware of it being mentally labeled. So we see a self as not just existing outside of causes and conditions, but something aside from this process of mentally labeling or mentally designating something. So we designate with terms and concepts. We use names, we use like a thought, an idea to designate something as existing. And as Lama Tsongkhapa has explained, that is the extent of its existence. We can't find something beyond that mere labeling, that merely mentally designating. If we are to try to search out and find the thing existing like from its own side in its own right, we can't actually find it. And so selflessness, in terms of there not being an autonomous self, does not just mean that there isn't an autonomous self in the sense of not relying upon causes and conditions, but also there isn't an autonomous self in the sense of a self existing separate from that process of mental designation or mentally labeling.
Oh yeah. Well, they the Sanje Chumde de Jagal Fedusa, Pumbule Tension Beta, Raw, Tapa Chibu, Raw, Tende Yosegora, Tade Nalolia, Yores, Tapa Imba, Chibu Imba, Suchil Tegomare, Tension Delegomare, Kora Chanjang Yotum Gesiora, Tapa Chibu, Rawase. Oh, Tende de Sanje Chumde de Mesum Gora, Taxi Rawachin Kitas, Pumbule Tension Betase, oh, the Messe. Di sanje chumde de ma chumbe ngwe chi tupe ma cha ti yu se yo ra. Ten sanje chumde de ti me so ti yo ma re so ra. Di son de ne nang ba te ya. Da me bar ma wa se do kon se. Da me ba na wa se. O ti ra e da me se phung bu le ten shen be da me so gu yo ma do. Chi ta de me de so gu yo ma re. Chi ta da me so gu yo ma ra. Ra e da ni chen ji da yo ma re su yo ma re tra yo ma re che tham je chi ba re. Cho tamje chikbar mato te ta de siwa mare su yore ta yo mare se long che phumbu yore su de tiru yore ta yo mare so che se mara te zo kanga me sura cho tamje rang shin ji tong ba na ba ya da wo che so ta wo ne su me ta me te me se kanga me su bu to ra we da ni chen ji chuk to ba shen da le de chen de ne ko mo sha me ko ba Koran chibu janjang tsu yue tengi ne chiyo mara sungora. Tinga zu tina long di long chima chishi maru nendura. Daji chawa tuji sem sungdo sanjek sungdo. Pumbi nalo la nga samsangi. Rawe nga yueba sambade tuji sem de ti neba chengengi. Rangla neba chengengi samlo de sungora. Kyune tawari yuwa de sa nga razu tinde yuwa tagi yuwa de ase. 다시 저와 되게 전에다 늦지 풍부 내동です 풍부가 나를 라와에 다든데 저 말다 동바르에서 늦지 풍부 내동です 내가 심지에 마이스 심지에다 가사다 식시 소세로 다그 민카리네 되나라를 주된 게 라와에 당이 제나라 주된 게 저 말다 소거라 저다 늦지 풍부 내동 내가 심지에 아니 간데에서 다 가요 말서 말은 말해 Chidar yanla tso namla tenne shingda chubata, tishin pumbu namdene kunzub simche she chudu wasungda. Tidu shingda pecha arwa. Ta tingsara jen namdru da kambudra da chuja dhamma da shibiyongda. Tizul pecha ne arwa, ko tidu zang shingda sidi kachin irwa chi kolura che mi be tina ten rwa yuwa sidi. 더 대사도 된 남주도 전라면도 와. 자 대수고 그러게 야나 라면도 사실 동대만 보이지라. 대수라 때진 전에 뭐 남주에서 필기에서 밥송에서 사실은 집이 견제서나 남주 견쇼셔서도 아마도 디날 남주 생계 라와지여나 사실은 견쇼나 거기에 마셔서 대고라. 대그면 도와서 떼냈다고. 사실은 떼진 전에 대를 받다셔지. 델리아 남주 샤고다. 대삼지 유수 좋아를 마도 남주 생계제 라와 찍되는 주소세요 말어. 디나신 다음에서 라와에 다요 말에. 풍부 차세를 대신해서 뭐부인의 차세를 대신해 양라전을 대신해 양라전요 말이지 양라를 대신해 양라전요 말이지 거라 어디를 마도 지단 다요 말이지 그 말아 뒤에 뭐 시샤치도 미마뭐 남부 다 캐는 말이지 다 딱지랑아제 다 딩에를 신다 시에 다 딩매가 캐는 게 얼마도 다 매스고 말 다음에는 동해 레타르바치고 그래서 동해를 타르베 탑디레스 디레 콤고레스 라페요 마라 다 요아래 땡지 제버는 줘다 땡에 딱 봤습니다 최 탐지 집어래 다 장장 말해 어떻게 làm 거야
So, this is important to understand correctly in the sense that the Buddha came along and taught that there is no self. So we have to understand this in the context of the kind of schools of thought that existed in India at the time of the Buddha. So there were those that would assert that there is like a permanent, autonomous, unitary self, that there's some kind of self apart from the aggregates that's like the controller of those. And so in that context, the Buddha taught that no, there is no such self. There isn't an autonomous, permanent, unitary kind of a self. There is no self that exists apart from the aggregates. So this is the kind of context in which the Buddha was teaching selflessness, and Buddhists then became known as proponents of selflessness. And so this doesn't just apply to persons, but rather this is all phenomena are the same, in that all phenomena, as we see like in the Heart Sutra, for example, all phenomena, forms and sound and taste and touch and smell, all of these lack inherent existence. So it's not just like the person who enjoys these various things is kind of lacking in a self, and those things have some kind of essential nature, but it is all phenomena that lack this kind of like a discrete essence that exists from its own side. So the Buddha has taught, and I'm sorry if I don't get the quotation exactly right, but this thought of I is the mind of Mara, is like the sort of a cause of all of our troubles. When we have this sense of I and hold to that, then we create all of these various kinds of faults. So within those aggregates, it seems as though there is some kind of like person or self, a being, a living being, and so forth. This also continues another kind of sutra quotation, but there is no such inherently existent person or self. So too, when it comes to all other external phenomena, they are likened to a chariot, which is the example they used to like to give, as something that is merely designated upon a collection of parts. Now, of course, we could update this and include things like planes and computers and any other sort of kind of example we want, in the sense that it is not as though there is something that exists apart from the kind of parts that are the basis of that thing. So, for example, if there was like a plane that existed apart from the parts of the plane, then when there is some sort of fault or issue with a particular part, we couldn't say, oh, well, the plane's broken, because the plane is separate from its parts. How can the plane be broken if the parts are broken? They're two separate things. And so here, when it comes to the kind of teachings that the Buddha gave, he taught selflessness in the sense of there not being such a self that exists by its own essence, by its own nature, whether of a person or any other phenomena, but rather things are merely designated upon a collection of parts. And so here, there are those that misunderstood this to say that the Buddha, to think that the Buddha was saying that there's no self whatsoever, that there's just nothing, there's no such self. Well, it's a particular kind of a self that is being denied. If it were the case that there were no self whatsoever, then why would the Buddha have talked about trying to attain liberation and so forth? So here, it's important to understand the kind of context in which the Buddha taught selflessness, and how that is not indicating a kind of nihilism where there's just absolutely no self whatsoever.
뭐야? 뭐 다른데 뭐에 대해서 다 가서래. 왜 지금 리버셔? 다 매봐서 다 단단 가지고 가서 템바시셔서 되나네. 동해 템베팅도 삼르타에들 개주 시셔라. 대신 메다서 주두셔래. 넘버 시시 템바시부터 넘버 시시 주두셔요라. 다들 강가셔야 되는 가서 심심 거고도. 당부들 동해 템베팅도 삼르타에들 고메디 시소로와. 메다바 동해와 동아 다메바스 시소라. 동해 템바를 다 가르 삼로 가르다네 다 녀모다 저서 강가데 추르당 거와. 제 땅에 가르 공부라서나 당부들 메다바다 동해와 공부라 사실 일년이 풍부. 지단 소수리 풍부나라서 바다 대천배 내 류론주 상마직 바로 메다바라와. 대체 탐제 메다바 소나시. 사실 일년이 풍부세. 내가 녀모발에 때는 랑고베 코에네 류론주 소수 소볼라서 바다서 상마 메다바를 성거라. 기지긴 좋아진게 교단 깽기왕게 야 깨된게 짱으로봐 교단 깽 메고 계시 코란데 따고 땜버시 대야시오 말에 간사를 지내 선부시 대야돼 교단 깽 망보지 소시 나로 내가 챙겨 간거 따다시 치롱던 중앙도 뜻도 따다대 내가 선부시 대하고도 엄마도 나 선부시 대기서 랑화전 대지 개요 말아 차시 망보를 떼고도 규진 망보를 떼고도 어때 이거 깨지를 거 유한두고 지거라 말한 줄 알고 말해 이름으로 나와 가시 니마 가시 근데 신이 뭐 깨르시네 유한두고도 체로 친시 다티 치시나 조라고 되도 하고 그러라 민대신에 니마한테 다시 다 깨셔서로 지 하고다 미다버라고 되도 하고 그러래 미다버 참어도 다마 토르다네 미치 게르네 그 로지날 홈트컬이 게 말와 계시 니리 나와 계기 롤로 계기 니마 계기 님바 저기 바로 얼마듯이 홈트컬이 뒤집도 같이 알게 말도 자고 계시를 좋아하는 누구 지겨라 되게 메다버 삼을 땅 그래서 그래 나라들가 수도 땅진 요래 류레 땅진 그러와 니메티 단다 예선 단다 예버때 니마 예선 단다 예버때 마음반 땡게 예선 땅진 요라 든진지스 나맹고보다 친맹고보 간거 쩌쩌 단지시고요 나미만에 나 단다 근데 삼도 니마 예땡게 부춘주 안메 고거나 요 단다 요 말아 네 단다 갱고 땡게만에 요 말아 아마 거기 주든 거 잡고 듣기 말아 어때 그 좋아하시는 티처 균인데 되어라 말이지 좀 믿음을 삼다 그래서 나를 삼는 나를 당진 요라 내 당진 류 당진 로주 당진 년이들에서 본 네가 당진 어디 믿음을 해서도 강가 야가시는 진종계리다 냠도 루루제 소된 게 지내 가가 종계리다 아주 주되잖아 싹 바꾸고 이제 타자지 덤보 남자 더동지 네배 타마 저와도 기회 타마 시원해서도 지난 뒤로라 간대지나 년이도 간대야 오시는 루루체 대해서는 소소소 가간 줘야 맞도 되게 말아 같이 쌓이네 그 쌓지 기도해서 말아 무슨 몇 기도를마다 타마지 세루라 소루라 사바군지 타제지 전부는 다 야고서 통보를 야가를 주네 마든 버릇이 매우셔라 그 따버릇이 봉부이나 봉부셔부시 대면도 집에 타마쳐 왔어 미다버셔도 어디 시에요라 코알리아 컨디션에 소설을 단다 표현서버 컨디션에 뒤samma 나도 된게 말하다 생주려 주제 이마지 매월에 그래서 되고 깨지 매번 요라 다 열열 녹여라 뒤sam버에 또서 그 sam버 타고도 돼서 말와 먼저 배치 단계를 타고를 쉬지 삼으려라 내 표현서버 리 표현서버 런지 표현서 코 표현서버나 뒤딱바르스 단계를 지 삼을 거되기도 뒤코에요 말해서 그거라 아주 쉽게 변하려고 다들 마음대로 가셔야 세워라 미래치 로버트 트로스나 트로스세 심대시에요 말에 심대시오라 국배 거둘 트로스 왔어 자데 합도 트로스 왔어 합도 트로스 말해서 내내 다 된게 어려서 그랬잖아 참살 당한 나기 때문에 도 스트레스 지어서 다도서 까부지 또 생각만 매달 시작했으나 또 참바 저기서 또 지기세들 난두로지를 다시 나게 어려서래. 저도 다대기 어려서 다 남기네 대대기 어려서 그래. 나라도 개소리가 말아 당신 말이. 나 다들 망불렀어. 미다바디야 지삼다. 지질라 벨다마 망다서라.
So here, in terms of selflessness, now in the teaching of the Four Noble Truths, the Four Noble Truths are taught with each four characteristics, meaning that we talk about the 16 characteristics or attributes of the Four Noble Truths. Now, if we get into all of them, it will take a little bit, but here, with regard to the first, the truth of suffering, there are four characteristics in terms of this truth of suffering, referring to these four kind of attributes of impermanence, suffering, emptiness, and selflessness. So here, based upon reflecting upon these various characteristics or attributes of this first truth, we are able to reduce somewhat our various afflictions, because when it comes to, as the Buddha has taught, all compounded phenomena are impermanent. Everything that is dependent upon causes and conditions is impermanent, and not just in the sense of like the kind of coarse impermanence that we are able to observe, but it is that things are changing moment to moment to moment. And he continues with all contaminated phenomena are in the nature of suffering and so forth. But here, when we look at, like, for example, our being alive, we have this sense that like our living is something that is stable, like, oh yes, I'm alive and I'm kind of alive from my own side, but it's actually we are dependent upon so many different causes and conditions, each of which is in and of itself momentary. They're changing moment to moment to moment. So here, when it comes to recognizing impermanence, we are able to see some of those coarse changes, like we see something one year and then we see it many years later, and we can see, oh, there's some kind of difference that came about. But we aren't really aware of the moment to moment to moment disintegration and change that is occurring. Like when someone ages, it's not as though they suddenly become old, but rather it's a process that's happening moment to moment to moment to moment. And they are constantly changing. It's not as though like we are not the baby that was in our mother's womb, nor like if we have gotten old, were we old from the start? But yet we have this sense of holding ourselves as like permanent, as if we had some kind of stability or permanence. Now, although it is the case that we are definitely not, say, the baby that was in our mother's womb, there is a continuity. There is the same continuum that has gone until now, and we will continue through. But we hold these things to be like permanent, as if they had some kind of lasting nature or stability to them. We don't have this sort of sense of the reality that we are changing moment to moment to moment. But reflecting upon this kind of impermanent nature, as the Buddha has taught, the sort of end of meeting, of gathering together is separation. The end of like getting really high up is falling back low. The end of gathering is dispersion. The end of birth is death. recognizing that whatever sort of excellent things that we have, whether it's our body, our various enjoyments, and so forth, these are changing moment to moment to moment. We have this sense that, like, these are really here. They're permanent. They're just like this. But by reflecting upon their impermanence, we can sort of soften that hard-headedness, that view, as though we were going to last and be stable. So here again, we have this kind of sense of like we are just going to remain as we are. But when we are able to reflect upon the fact that actually we are impermanent, although we hold ourselves to be like, oh well, I'm here. I'm going to last for a long time. That isn't actually the reality. Even when, say, for example, someone says like, oh, that person died so suddenly. Well, there are all kinds of causes and conditions that led to that coming about. It didn't happen sort of without any sort of causes and conditions. When we get to the point where we are like older and needing help and all those kinds of things, it doesn't seem as though that were due to causes and conditions. It seems like it just sort of happened or it existed by itself, but it is through our reflection, particularly on this attribute of impermanence, that we can get rid of some of that, again, like hard-headedness that comes from our grasping at our various possessions and body and enjoyments as being somehow permanent and lasting.
Oh yeah. Oh, that midaba tende samlutande. Tambuto sa madete yorwa. Oh, nimbu mengere tonje semle chonare sha. Kichinde yore te yina ko tabwaris te samlutande na. Paruchila tende chi yawanda karichona midaba yin samlukona. Chima tuwa chichosona ane ko soto gyora. Nene samlu nal ko kutu yora. Oh, tende re sa samlu de tambu to sa madete yora. Tende tensan shekdo chiwa metaba shida sheki yo marase. Mizu kibu yo mare. Kibu yonya cheshi shekurse. Kibu yonya chere de metaba shene kaliguri samlu tanda. Ane kone samlu tanda koran juwadu kura. O tende ko. Tangzin che de masha takwa jo tende takwa ristus tenge nye samlu. Nima chi chile de ane meji yo shewa che yungudwa. Tunga soyo tokura. Ngene de yunguri de yunguri rangshi re sambayna. Ni kaliguri komsona. Midaba kadine samko chambada tsawada teziring dele yabuji dego sam roa tunge gal tunge seni chome samsa samlo koto roa ane chekale ti yo mare o nyingbo mewara shini midaba jibe cha shini sa chwa midaba yin sa so midaba yin sa tende chi me a samda e chwe nyingbo dele ko da di tende ke yo mare ko ran shiri sam se tungi chagra 당부 또 삼단도 또 미지바 여기 또서 저 미지바 주나 야가를 지어라 나게 매우다 너 셔야 동에 연대네 교회 적버세 वर्ष에서 코아발은 인지지 미션의 관계내 주랑다 신 관계내 당원에 뜻도 섬을 떠나를 지고라 신달의 인지 지어래 지나시리 아서 동해 쪽으로 동해란 시절에서 오 교회 적버세 가지고 봐봤니 계략관시 되는 점수도 동해 영해 상마대 미케 레부데 삼 대화요에 삼마 케 레부데 삼 니리 메시나 티보치니 이파 개와치니 주베티 삼고도 티보 춘주지나 오 내가 전부다 삼 고베날 집에 도나시 삼고 위자라 어디인데 그 가지 도나시요 말아 어디데 다든다 어디질라다 당부 삼을 메다버도 삼을 땅고래서 땅에 또서 미지버 주나 그요 말했으면 또서 다 처음 영부면도 왔습니다. 근데 공성의 야구여래. 또나지 게 영부면은 잠바다 싸워다 지 삼바 사르치 아 되게 인삼 공도 취네. 제망원의 중에 거래 대선비 남자다 시나 매봐 고해랑 신신이 때마다 매섭사 어디 전에 교화 쪽에다 되고 봐야도 소리야. 삼로랑 신지 쳐르셔 쳐로라. 어딘데 그봐요라. 야 되지라.
So, here talking about impermanence, when we think about impermanence, there is a kind of discomfort that can arise from that. But actually, when we contemplate on death and impermanence, this is something that in the long term will bring us greater sort of peace, mental peace and happiness, and give us the ability to kind of bear with whatever comes our way. We recognize, oh, this is in the nature of impermanence and so forth. So here, when it comes to this is something that slowly changes our way of thinking. So, an initial reflection upon death and impermanence may provoke a kind of discomfort, a kind of negative feeling. But in the long term, it will actually be quite beneficial to us in terms of our mental peace and happiness. And so, the kind of if we are able to reflect upon impermanence in a genuine way, this changes our sort of thinking such that it's actually easier for us to generate, say, love and affection and so forth. We see, oh, there's no real sort of hard, solid essence, nature to all of these things. There's no certainty within samsara, and that kind of acceptance can then generate a better understanding, actually create more mental peace for us. There are some that say, like, oh, well, I don't want to hear about death and impermanence. That's like, it's making me sad. Dharma is supposed to be about like sort of uplifting and helping us. But this is actually going to be beneficial for us in the long term. So to have a little bit of discomfort at first actually then leads into lots of beneficial results. So there is a verse which explains that our suffering can help us to eliminate our arrogance, our sense of pride. It gives us a kind of suffering helps us to develop an attitude of compassion for others. Suffering also makes us more cautious with respect to our non-virtuous actions. So here, when we are experiencing suffering, it can kind of get rid of our pride, our sense of like, oh, I'm so much, because you encounter things that are out of your control. So suffering helps to eliminate that kind of pride. It also, suffering allows us to connect with the suffering of others and thereby give rise to compassion and love and so forth. And suffering, when we connect that with an understanding of how it is that due to our own non-virtuous actions, we are experiencing suffering, this will help us to avoid negative actions in the future. When we, in the future, commit negative actions, we will have this feeling like we've swallowed poison, like we know we are going to bring about our own future suffering. So here, it makes us better at developing love and compassion and eliminates our pride. Is something that is really beneficial. So while at the beginning it might be a little bit uncomfortable to hear about impermanence and death and so forth, in the long term, it helps us to accept the kind of uncertainties within samsara, the reality of things, and helps us in terms of avoiding non-virtue and developing our compassion.
Oh yeah. Oh, dice, tiene medabas, tiene tunge de samrta ura. Tunge ode. Oh, te educas ure. Jitan ko keve tunge sera. Ke du keve tunge ore, nave tunge ore, chive tunge ora. Ane tukba dan treve tunge se. Yitu wante de katre ure. Mitukba dan treve tunge, meko getende, tuwetende yora. Tukba dan treve tunge, mitukba dan treve tunge se. Ane, mendeba thodu babe, deba matruche, mendeba thodu babe yora. Dona nyawalembe pumbu nga tunge sikdo. Dona ngarazo pumbu korande, suji pumbu te tunge jiranshi, tunge tenge tsoa dere yora. Tsoa dege tunge tenge yora. Tsoa dewa da tunge susu samlu tochi chunde, kacho chose, tochi mandine tucho chose, nesembe miji hisha kanga susu sasha yora. Tsoa de ko tunge chunge tunge rade, shenda ya chi tante made mambu samlu tane, tunge sa yora, tsoa tunge achire. Suji bo tsoa. Deshi to samutanda de ya tongere, samutanda yabu, yabu je samutanda koche de tumba samutanda yabu ora. Ame ngaje chato ende se che te de militsawa che samutanda so 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 mi je chanora. Samutanda chane tunge che so 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 mi ju sa chara. Number sheba sem khorade. Tunge je ran shi je kontro ngaje dran sim da che da mi de tunge yo ye ke pasha ya ka de ra. सबसे मचने सब करे ना तो जांजा खोया कि नेबे पे थोमा में वाले ये तक और तो ठीक है तुम्हें चुची वाला ठीक देखो कर सोरा 어쩌죠 강가 동해 삼로 다야다 지단 그 동해기 동해세 동해 원에 이버들 가져 하고라 동해 동해 국가체 대대부 동해라 교래 동해세 다른 아주 대화세야 돼그 강의 지연에 되게 매나서 아니 매백급 캐서는 대화 넘기 요라 마도지 원에 대화 말해서 대화랑 셈바 말이잖아 얘네 그 대회 교대 산산보도 대화도 다 대고 그래도 대대면 도와줘라 교래 동해에서 거의 동해를 그래 겨반 도지기 동해에서도 감성관에 켜면 레다 녀문배 샹화제 소자 가르용도에 매치하고 요 말아 다 단단가지고 레다 녀문배 샹화래 교황아마 레 가르사이 녀무공에 레 가르사이 다 가르용도에 땡데게 요 말아 지지 또 가르치고도 맞지게 근데 가르용도에 땡데게 요 말아 자 레녀지 샹화제도 도시라 겨반 도지기 동해도 도시지 와라 삼로 단계 속에 동해지 동해든 교회 동해는 교회 동해도 또와를 지어라. 그 마요에 그 갑리 용에 탑시체 동해 지어라. 얘네 동해 코랑 대화도 중에 갑들이 아니anga 망부여라. 뒤태 아유 집탐을 샤면 가르쳐서. 정말 매우 잘나도 들리게 동해 와라. 자꾸 강가 삼로 땅에 지기는 뒤강가 동해기 시치기 와래서. 코아코란테 동해지랑 시치래서. 시자 신자지에 매를 삼상. 근데 삼을 거고라. 디지리 메달에 동해서래. 미다바 소자고 야가시네 고 준도에 지레 되어라. 다 대게 말와. 야가시네 디반 줄서는데 동해 계곡으로. 무슨 소보다 따와 대게 말와. 준도라 미다바 소자. 근데 동해 계곡도 와. 내년에 시험하지 미다바 소자. 때문에 동해 용거리에서 디지리 메달에 동해에서. 어디질라나.
음,
코에네 류롱주 된도 삼로 따야 되다 니버데
mm,
저어져서 류라서 뭐 풍부가라서
mm. So, thinking then, the first characteristic is impermanence, and the second is suffering. Now, generally, we have all kinds of suffering. We have the suffering of birth and aging, sickness and death. We have the suffering of like not getting what we want, having unwanted things befall us, trying to get those things that we want and not being able to, and so forth. So, really, in brief, these contaminated aggregates that we've taken up due to karma and afflictions are in the nature of suffering. So we can examine, I mean, the nature of suffering includes like our abode, our possessions, our enjoyments, and so forth, but really focusing first on the aggregates, our own body. Like our form is in the nature of suffering. Think about how like it's always sort of on the verge of suffering when it comes to the various kinds of suffering that we experience. Our body is the basis for many of those suffering experiences. And so, too, when we go to the next aggregate, our feelings are also in the nature of suffering. Again, we are like sort of almost on the verge of or ready to give rise to suffering feelings all the time. The kind of the way that we think as well, our discrimination or discernment, the way that we distinguish various things and label them and identify them, that kind of mental process as well is the basis of many of the kinds of suffering that we experience, as we discussed before, the way that we create our own mental suffering. And so too, our consciousness is filled with these kinds of imprints or latencies for future suffering. We have laid these down through our actions in the past, and it's like our consciousness is just sort of filled with those imprints of future sufferings. So it's easy for us to see the kind of suffering, that sort of abject suffering that we all identify as that. There's also that kind of suffering of change. We hold something as being pleasurable, as being really good, but it's actually in the nature of changing. It's not in the nature of real, true happiness. It's not lasting or enduring in any way, but yet it's going to transform. It's going to change into suffering. So then there is the level of the fact that the pervasive suffering of conditioned existence. There is no certainty in samsara. We have taken up these contaminated aggregates due to the control of karma and the afflictions. And this is really the worst kind of suffering, because we are in this situation of having taken up such aggregates due to our karma and the afflictions. There's no certainty. We experience all of these kinds of suffering, and that level of the pervasive suffering of conditioned existence is then the kind of highest, the worst level of suffering. So when we have these things that we grasp at as being like pleasurable or enjoyable, we don't see them as being really in the nature of suffering, whether it's our body or our mind or all of those things. We cling to it as though it were somehow, again, permanent, and as if we had some kind of control over it. But actually, this is not something that we should be clinging to as so excellent, as so perfect. First, contemplating its impermanence, the fact that nothing remains as we want it to or as we would have it. It's instead in the nature of being impermanent, momentary, changing moment to moment. And due to that fact, it's contaminated. We are also contaminated in the sense of being under the control of our karma and afflictions. And so contemplating impermanence then leads into the contemplation of suffering and recognizing, again, that all of this is in the nature of suffering. Samsara, referring to our abode and our possessions and even our body, are in the nature of suffering. This is the second characteristic of the first noble truth.
Oh yeah. 다른데 미다바다 동에 삼을 딴데 근데 동에 주디 가래나 삼삼을 거고요라. 미다바다 동에 와데 삼을 다 코에네를 longe 소소르라 소보카가 삼단데 다 교강을 때는 쇼레서 삼을 거고요라. 티 매버서야 요나면나. 주지 요나 고 주디 매버서는 매버차요라. 근데 교요리다 시티 현대적이 딱뭐 tempo 주대 제법으로 제 소샤게는 소소제게요 말아. 어디 밀라고요 망아라지 교황만에 사셔베 내가 녀모만 이게 졸래 때는 연구요다스 동해 강가데 녀모고하게 비교해서 연구하래 대화 강가데 아니 자 소소를 신자고하게 계획해서 왔던 연구하래서 거라 거기에 대화다 동안이 있어야 어디 이도 가서 오라 얘는 군중법에 담바와서 따뜻해서 가와 총으로서는 아니 내가 녀모를 총으로 현다 집하고 쓰요 말에 소소다 koa simche chitungda sosu kyo ngamanam sosabe leda nyamola tani chumuris kunju tembe de shera. Tatini kunju tembe tani ya namba shishe tati she mocha. Tani kunju de. Tani kunju de meba soya yore yo maresi de o kunju de nyamo de meba soya yore ese. Nyamo go tsawa tatu zebati re ese. Tangzin di re ese. Ti meba soya yore se. Nyamo sebe seba yore ese. Gobe tembe de she yore. Tele namba shisha, tatu shamocha. Gobetaba. Gobate toya yoribasina, top togure, lam congres, tame topa lam congres, sera. Or lam congres, any tata the carry was toa the taming ite yungora. Toa the taming in the committee lam congres, the caras, tome maripalite chungore, tome maripatike, yungisa, tome maripati mevas over. Take it. Rāngwē tā yuban sī kiwa rē, tā rāngwē tā mē bā, tōngwā tā tāmi sī kituwa. Pūmbu liyā rāngwē tā tēng shēng jē yuwa mā rē, pūmbu kōrā rāngwē tā ki tā ngī tuwa chū yuwa mā rē, tīndi tā rāngwē tā yuwa mā rē sī. Tōngwā tā tāmi ngī tī, lām jī tēmbā sāma kūdi yuwa nī shī nē sāma tāngu rā. Kēchū tī jidēn jī nē lū lōngshū sōsū lū lū sōpa tē sū tēntu sāma tāngu tuwa. 동해 때문에 계속 시식이라. 어제도 람데 군데 내 동화도 다메스. 다다긴 간주 다메시에 봐. 풍부레 대셔베 다요 말에. 풍부는 이제 라오에 다도 주요 말에서. 동화도 다메스도. 풍부레 대셔베 라오에 다요 말에서 동바스 거래. 풍부 고난은 이제 라오에 당니도 주요 말에서 다메 바스 거라. 다단다 라오에 다도요 말에 풍부리아 라오에 다요나 rāngwē tātē phūmbū tā chīk tā tādē kāng rū tu yō kūrē, chīk tā tādē kāng tu yō mā rē, tōngā tā tāmē nye tē kyūsēn tē shē yō rā. Wō tē lamdengi namba kumdiyo ni kumgiyora. O tichi shenen tigre. Yeah.
So here, reflecting upon all of this as in the nature of being impermanent and suffering, if we are reflecting upon our own body and enjoyments and this abode as being in the nature of suffering and being impermanent, well, then the contemplation arises, well, what's the cause of all of this? If there is a cause, then by eliminating that cause, we can achieve a cessation of this suffering. If it were the case that there isn't really a cause in the normal sense, but like it were all brought about by some kind of creator or just were, then we couldn't do anything about it. But it is the case that there is actually a cause of our suffering, of our samsaric suffering and pleasure, in the sense that this arises from our karma and afflictions. So the kind of things within samsara that we experience as pleasurable come about from virtuous actions that are due to our sort of grasping at an I. And so this, whether it is our suffering experiences or the sort of samsaric pleasures that are in the nature of suffering, this has an origin. It has a kind of cause. So there is a cause that leads to our experience of this suffering. And so this leads into the kind of contemplation of the origin of suffering. We don't need to get into the 4 characteristics of that origin of suffering, but having recognized that there is a source to the sufferings that we experience, then we see that, well, there is this kind of root cause, this grasping at a self, this grasping at an I is the root cause that leads to our experiences of suffering. And then the question arises, well, is there some way to eliminate that cause, to get rid of it, such that we eliminate the kind of resultant suffering? So here, this is wherein the truth of cessation. There is a possibility of a cessation from our suffering, and that is through the development of the proper kind of antidotes or the truth of the path. And so when it comes, then we won't get into the 4 aspects of each of those 3 later truths, but getting back to the last 2 aspects of the truth of suffering, this really gets at how we then go about eliminating that suffering. So the 2 aspects of emptiness and selflessness, in order to get rid of that mistaken grasping at a self that leads us to then accumulate karma through our various afflictions, we do that through developing what is called the path, developing in understanding that there is no such autonomous, independent, self-existent kind of a self as we have grasped there to be. But by realizing the selflessness of persons and phenomena, then we are able to eliminate the kind of resultant suffering. So here, in these 2, the aspect of emptiness and selflessness. Emptiness in this context is referring to the lack of some kind of a self apart from the aggregates, aside from the aggregates, and no autonomous and selflessness is referring to there not being some kind of autonomous self. We examine this through looking at, well, if there were such an autonomous, independent self in the way that it appeared to us, then it would have to be either one with or different from the aggregates. And using such reasoning, one can come to understand that no such self exists. And it is this realization of selflessness that then leads to a true cessation, that elimination of our afflictions.
뭐야. 다 탐마 당하지 말라 저기다. 탐마를 럽고 봐. 내래 탐제 집에 다 기부. 단다 땅마도 가가 기분 정다 전부 투무를 남기를 버티셔서라. 다단다 탐마를 럽고 봐. 기부 전부를 남기고 좀 메고 시고라. 탐마를 럽고 봐. 내래 탐제 집에 네발레 와서도 좋아 메베서 와. 레바데 코에 레바르지니 야서 준도 해시와라. 도샤. 내래스 땡도 레고 고네 마다 준네. 멜레고 차야 메베서라. 내래 탐제 침배 토베 탐내세 토마라니 기부 충우다스테 딸로사라 아니 쟁게 람로로 총에 값수 라니 텐데 야라 중니지 코네 년도다 텐데 코아르 죽보다스 Tome Maribase, Tendiana Juni Kone Kwakuju Samutangura, and Kwakuju Samra the Kabri, Noida Tanduliki, Kabri Metal Halaki Tendition, Duari to the Korati Shesarado. Oh, Yana Juni Kone Tendu, Koraju Bata, Kole, Nanikare, Kwan Dobe Tabra, Kwan Dobe Sambe Rani Koa. Kwan dobe sambale ese. Rani koar minjugi sambaki wata. Ta kibun dengi kapso. Tende yala chungi kone kwa kochu samdisa. Rwa. Mene rani koar. Koar doso. Mora dobe chu sambe. Rani koar minjugi sambaki wata. Koar dungeji ranshin iba samlutan doso. Koar le trende ki minjugi kirwa. O tate yakumadu tile tarashi. 제고서를 저 통마면 맞다고도 도셔 단다도 스코르코시나 동해 망부 녀야를 샤서 따들을 타고 자고서 민족이 삼바치 그리잖아. 저와다 코알에 타버는 데에 주메지 로께와다. 다 코알에 탑되기. 코알에 네번주 전되기 로께와. 근데 타버 타고도 살로 좀 많이 뵙게 그래서 숙청부지 그래서라. 근데 기부 쳔베 남라 로청에 갑데르세. 기부 쳔베 남라 로저 갑데르. 아니 라한다라와 심지어 시행남자 다 라니 코아 텐데 하나 중이 코네 코아 구조 삼르다는 내주다 타바토니 로치마 많이 베기고라 어때나 시다 심지어 소소 파마년들라 소바테조 도마메바네 코아 코드 텐데 하나 중이 코네 도스코네 루아리르도 코르게오레 삼삼르다기오레셔라 데 삼르다데 콘조 동에다 트렌드 유로티기오레셔 Kamdi randa drawa simja shenam gyatende yana chungi ki kone koan judo ki chu samba yin las. Shenda rangi pamala sopa shenda karenti koa kordanti samlutanga garen. Tedar samba le rangshen ki koa la kiawa thongma meba. Tende samlutanga ta randa shen ki kiawa la thongma me doa sam. Doa. Kiawa la thongma me na. Yani kasoda. Tele chendi pama nyendre dan drawra. Chendi pama nyendre dan drawa kiawa ngama namsu ya shenda shenga chene. Pama nyendre le sokwa sosul pen tonga simjen di pen toren di pen me tore samsa. Loga cheye si mido asa tamze. Rangi ngoma shimbo mado. Rangi pada mado nyenyi tu la sokwa chola sokwa tide. Yursha samge wara. Goma namsu ya rangi pama nyendre sosul tame bar. Yure su shene simjen tamze la mar shebata. Ma chebe simjen samage sosul chende manashi. 파마나시 라나 텐시와 가르네 티네시 제샤세 라데 마트렘바 마도 갑데다도 첸디 파마다 식바치냐 콘주 카디 짜요레사 데달라 첸데르 라데 마단드라와 아니 제수 티테 심부임바 하고네 틸레제고레 삼겨레세라 심제 샤 탐제 첸디 마단드라와 영어도 전에 영어기 잡아토네라 마시트데테서 영어 잡아 Ninji Chabuki, ora. Sadan Temba Juada Shea, the Wandula to me Mendebe, Tata, or Tiba the Chidona, ya. Young Chambala Soba, something Temba Jus, Marshal to the young Chabak, ya.
No.
Peggy Lotion, and Namunis, yeah.
No. So then picking up here in the text, the essential teachings for the end, the teachings on the highest definite goodness of omniscience. So here, someone who is trained kind of in the common path. So it says, the method of attaining the highest definite goodness. And when we refer to definite goodness of liberation or omniscience, in this case, omniscience, that is referring to a kind of irreversible, unchanging sort of goodness, that kind of state that will no longer fall back into samsara. So here, when in the beginning you train your mind in the paths of the persons of beginning and middle capacities as stated above, you consider through the 12 factors of dependent arising how one enters cyclic existence and how one ends cyclic existence, and through this generate the attitude of determination to be free from cyclic existence and the uncontrived mind that desires liberation from it. So here we reflect upon our own kind of situation that since beginningless time we have due to this ignorance then experienced rebirth, sometimes in the lower realms, sometimes in the higher realms, and so forth. But it is this kind of contemplation in relation to ourselves that generates, that helps us to give rise to that uncontrived sense of wanting to get out of samsara. So I would just give a rough overview of this because I think this is something that you all know. But to come to see samsara as being in the nature of suffering and understand the process by which one gets into samsara or engages in samsara, thinking along these lines is what helps us to generate the strong desire to get out of that uncontrived wish for liberation. And so, in the same way that we think of this in relation to our own situation, likewise, when training your mind in the path of the person of greatest capacity, you contemplate how other beings, like yourself, enter into cyclic existence through the 12 factors of dependent arising and how they end cyclic existence. So, from this contemplation, you understand your own and others' births in cyclic existence as being beginningless and without number. So, here, in the same way that we cycle uncontrollably into samsara due to first this beginningless ignorance, so too other sentient beings are in this exact same situation. And this cycle of taking rebirth has no beginning. And so, contemplating that, then you comprehend that over the course of all of previous lives, all other living beings have been your dear parents, like your dear parents of this lifetime. Recognizing all beings as your mother, you recall that when acting as your mother, they were so kind, just like your mother of this lifetime. So again, thinking about the fact that even though we don't recognize it, all other sentient beings have acted in this capacity, just like our own mother of this life, the way that she showed us kindness, so too every other sentient being has shown us that kindness at some point. And so you then wish to repay their kindness, just as you do your mother of this lifetime, becoming repeatedly accustomed to these three ways of thinking. You have come to have the love that feels affection for all other living beings, just as you would your own mother of this life. So it is based upon this kind of contemplation about countless previous lives and the kinds of kindness that other beings have shown you that we give rise to an attitude of affection, a kind of loving affection for all other sentient beings.
오야 다던다 그 존재 맹아 던지고네 삼거동제 semjete samwa tungede trawa cheburu rang chebu tungele thare thapchana madire samgidwa o te karsoro ta marshe bad so semje kanga so mate kadin chishu chegra te chana samta bara te maige parshe bala so barwa rang trobu kadin chembutine rang trobu so sheba sara rale kegen lobda chenge kadin chembu shebu na teneshi duriore samsa rowa ene tōpura wa tinte yōna tōmu yōna kare ina soso chēshū tinte māgyuru ya chindila soso chēshū ra kanda yōna tina shi māgyube kio ngā ma namsu māgyube simja yō ma re sam tsāma tēchimbu kia re te ware kichipe nō ngō ma shimbu ma tō samche teso tsāma tōngai te trewe tabshi bēgu ra ma tō soso chibu tōngai re tawe tabche na ma dribu re sam teso tōngai te tawe tabche wala tanda rāng nipa yōnso yō ma re te ndo rāng 탑다 싫어 네가 탈심에 산제지 고만 토바치는 데네 콘지탄 쳤고 그래서 대체도 다다네 그 삼삼을 거고요라 대중대 맹아 되지 권에 자주셔도 섬기 주시오라 야 되게
So here, this is describing the kind of sevenfold cause and effect method for giving rise to this attitude of bodhicitta, thinking instead, like if we were to just pursue our own liberation alone, that wouldn't be right. That would not be a kind of upstanding thing to do. It's not just me who is in this situation of samsara. Now, normally in this kind of contemplation, we think about the mother. The mother is someone who has usually shown us the greatest kindness in this life, but it does not have to be one's mother. If it was your father who showed you great kindness, or maybe it's a friend or a teacher, the most cherished being that you know of in this life, reflecting upon the kindness that they have shown you, you come to see that all other sentient beings, other than our not recognizing it, they have all acted in that same capacity towards us, showing us such great kindness. And so to just disregard all of these other beings and pursue our own aims alone would really be quite unsuitable. And so this kind of contemplation, this is the method by which we are able to generate this sort of attitude, thinking about the welfare of others. And then we come to recognize, well, right now I don't currently have the ability to be able to really benefit them fully. And so this is where our striving for that state of perfect, complete enlightenment in order to be able to benefit others arises.
뭐야? 다 니버들의 당신냠제권에 섬겨주 시행이거라. 근데 라니께 도마 매반에 다바라. 라체반에 다 라체제 겨 도마 매반에 제 라체반제네. 단데버도 대르데 라케 신부 야가지게 주토미도 와삼기와라. 라체제게 겨 삼다거라. 네 semjen신 야와르도네 라체바라. 짐바를 껴 간다간지. semjen신 야와르도 라케 셰셰제 라게 단달 셴데 코에 삼다네. 단데버도 코아코르지 데르마도 소소케 셰셰르치 제네 야부슈질케 레요 마라삼 테껴 삼다. 산제된 장주 선바도 셴케 셔와치체 셴데 자발테네 근데 단달코 산케도 와서라 라레 셴셰반 짐발테네. 간다 간초에 연den도 삼드시고라 라레 셴 야와라 도어사 근데 가서래 콤발레 라라 셴다르 야와르도 단다바도 저 도마 매번에 라게 셴 야와르도 그거라 따따레코 라 야와르도네 셴 기탄다 쪽이네 삼도라 라라 셴다르 야와르 도로다 셴라 단다바도 라제 버지번에 셴데다 게시슈적이 삼도라 rāla shēndara chēpara zimbā kōne tā shēn chēvē samlō tātā shēn chēvā gyāyā tā tōma mēwa nē rā samsā rā chē shū chē tē tā shēn yawar ndōwa tē samlō chēvā gyāb chē tā shēn chē shū chē rā yawar ndō kuyā rā kārē sēne tōma mē rā kē chē shū chē tē kyā mā tō yondē mūdō sā sāngyē tē chāngchū sēmbā tō tō shēn chēvā zimbā lē tē nē tāndā sāng kē yō rēs tā nōr shā samlō tāndā khurā sam chē nē tē chī kō rā semjen shenla tetabu chambe semdan denbar chede se ane semjen nam tenjen brocho ya ya de ta che samba ke wa yin shin se ya tipo de lapshana
So then is a section on the method of generating bodhicitta through the equalizing and exchanging of self and others. So furthermore, you think over repeatedly how you are equal to others in wanting happiness and not wanting suffering. How problematic it has been that from beginningless time up until now, you have held on to the idea of cherishing yourself and have engaged in ways of thinking that neglect other sentient beings or other living beings. So if we were to be in a really awesome position, if we were to have great things from this kind of self-cherishing attitude, it would be quite different. But we see that this sort of self-cherishing attitude has basically led us to repeatedly cycling in samsara, all of these kinds of sufferings. So by thinking about the faults, the defects of this self-cherishing attitude, we can see that it's not something that is benefiting us or others. And in turn, how beneficial it is that the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, for the sake of others, disregard themselves and cherish others as they would themselves. So by contemplating the faults of our self-cherishing attitude, we are led by our self-cherishing and look at where we have gotten ourselves. Whereas Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, who have such incredible qualities, look at what they have attained based upon switching those sorts of attitudes. Instead of thinking only about themselves and only pursuing their own aims. Instead, they sort of neglect themselves and pursue the needs and aims of others. And so by changing those attitudes, by exchanging those, Buddhas and Bodhisattvas have managed to achieve such incredible qualities, whereas holding myself as most important, basically, where have I gotten myself? What has this led to? And we can see the faults of our self-cherishing and the benefits that come from cherishing others. So becoming accustomed to these thoughts, again, repeatedly contemplating the kind of benefits of that attitude of cherishing others and the defects of such a self-cherishing attitude, you produce the attitude of exchanging self and other by forgetting about yourself as you usually forget about others, and by cherishing others as you cherish yourself.
Oh yeah. Rotten that I send yam just here, you tell what's in virtue de ko give lot of chamber that I'm virtue by some chamber called them to share mato. Chita kangal share sike marwa. Taineko till Sambatan to the day of Burwa. Nada send the Chechawa, Saya Tambachaber Charsam da Chechula. Mikangal Sheniko, Penta Chio Marico, Lord Chu Marto. Sama Cheche called Kibu to Ronge, some catching Butan to get the Zulshare with the Soda. Dada send the Chechawa, Saya Tambachas. Tashan Yamjisuda, Tashan Yamba. Yamba said the Tata Wandela to him and the Bashin to Shaka, the Wandela to him and the Tanja, some Yamba some Tangra. And the social chibu tawa the case me the case chunju but the dream and do some things no do you do some that chibu jago somewhere. Rale shen dar cheber jimbache. Marishal ran dar cheber jimbache. Rale tenga shen yavar do na she yavar dorka some. Oh, this somebody chane. Tashan yam you could chachu chota sem kebas at the sigara. Oh, this to do shilama.
So here, this practice of equalizing and exchanging self and others, this is, again, of course, a Mahayana Dharma, and it is something that is taught for those that are really of vast, expansive kind of mindsets that have a particular sort of mental fortitude. This is not something that is easy to engage in the practice of. So as Shantideva has explained in his Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, this kind of practice of equalizing and exchanging self and others is something that is kept sort of secret. We practice it in secret, and it's also only taught to those who are suitable disciples. So when we come to see the kind of faults of our self-cherishing attitude, and instead the benefits that come from an attitude which cherishes others, this is based upon the kind of understanding of an equalizing, an equality in the sense of we are all the same in not wanting to suffer and wanting to have happiness. And then we see the faults of our self-cherishing and try to exchange that in the way that we normally disregard others. We are going to disregard ourselves and instead come to cherish other sentient beings. This is the way in which we train our minds, and it's particularly for those who are of sort of a strength of mind and have a kind of mental fortitude.
Oh yeah. That is what Tashachi Sambaki was in Shiro. Tashachi Sambaki was in Shiro. Simjanam la tetabu chambesam dan dembar chete Shiro. Simjanam tenji debrajo yala chuni jikone and Kuar Jubatan Dobe Chusambanas. That's Simjan to Tente Yala Chuni Kone Kuar Kortan Kulu to Samutangora. So the permanent dealers over Simjan Chine go to. And it didn't actually Simjan that someone to the Resha Samse. Conto Tommy Maru Kunela, Niban de Juliasa, and it brought it to Tendabatus. Toma Matanda Court Everesam, Kwakuzu to Samutangora. Sambanas and the Marju Simjan. Tetaja Randan Rawa Kuetungajan Narwa, Nawala Rani, messages, Susutendi ala Junikone Koetunga Samne, and then call a Kyoto Sum, but there was a Tarwache with the Sambanashi, Shensim Gentata, call a Tarwache with Osam, Pamanian Delas over Renekone, Catcher Chertangiora. But Tata Tunga Tata Tower de Ninji Chimbucation, Simja Tamja Tunga the Tower Chao Nyambe, Ninji Chimbucation. Ninji Chimbucation. Yeah, people to Chilamna, Ninji Chimbukiabana.
So then after you have, in this way, become endowed with a loving mind for all beings, you contemplate how these beings enter cyclic existence through the 12 factors of dependent arising and how they could reverse that process. So in the same way that we cycle through samsara due to first ignorance and then formative actions and so forth, so too do all other sentient beings. So feeling in this way, kind of you have a loving attitude towards all sentient beings, that leads us then to once you do this, just as you cannot bear being tormented by the sufferings of cyclic existence in this way, so you cannot endure others being tormented in this way. You then produce the great compassion that wants to free them from suffering. So here, in the same way, like when we first contemplate the process of cyclic existence, the 12 links in relation to ourselves, we have a wish to get out of that. And then when we turn and apply that to others, maybe first looking at those that are our loved ones, our mothers, our fathers, friends, and dear ones to us, we have this thought of being unable to bear their suffering, their cycling in cyclic existence in that way. And then we extend that to all sentient beings without any kind of divides and give rise to this attitude of great compassion that wants to free them from their suffering.
Oh, yeah. The target subject 탐제 동에다 저를 시도 교육세 방도주 연대 탐제 원수 소부 상제제 고바 토반되게 자주고 심께네스 당신 염제권의 심께서라 체도 자와 제세 잔주 심배 주바 바로 심배 주라 넘고반에 기부 심배 기부 심배 쳐서 타마르로 그뱅 엘레쳐 스타트인데 기부 심배 쳐들이야 근데 내가 되기고네 삼루다지 대체치도 산지 고바 토바치 대체 동일에 대체치도 산지 고바 토바치 위해서 당신잠 제고네라 다 삼루당다 코라랑 펜토마도 들려 삼루마다네 다 단대보도 라잔자 라진진 견다 셴 여완도에 견 삼루당다 다 삼루코라 접접지 현등 버시시에 셴지 더주에도 랑게터에 봐삼 당신잠 제고네 자주셔도 섬게 봐서
So, then you generate the spirit of enlightenment that wants to attain the high state of a Buddha who has eliminated all faults and completed all good qualities, stemming from eliminating what is to be eliminating and realizing all that is to be realized for the sake of your being able to free all living beings from their sufferings. So here, and then it continues saying, in order to do this, you must practice the 6 perfections, the deeds of the Bodhisattvas, who are the heirs of the Buddhas for eons. This is the teaching for the person of great capacity, the teaching you must train in at the end. So here, when it comes to the kind of contemplations for the being of great scope or great capacity, there are different ways to generate this attitude of the mind of awakening, or this enlightenment mind, wishing to become a Buddha for the sake of all sentient beings. One is through the 7-fold cause and effect method, and the other through equalizing and exchanging self and others, really exchanging our self-cherishing attitude for an attitude that cherishes others. And based upon that attitude of this mind of awakening, then one engages in the practice of the 6 perfections. This is the teaching for the person of great capacity, or sort of the end level of training.
Oh, yeah. The Kuan Jukdoji Sudo, Kuan Jukdoji Kudu Kandis Kugiore, Kuan Mavison and Donna, Kandis Dogore, Titsu Shigiora. Toma Rani Kwa Kuju Samne, Susu Kwa Kordan Kulu Samne. She's a Kale Kwa Kichi Dube, Zawa de Kare Chene, Kwa Kurgore, Samti Samtangura, and the Kwa Kone, Rame by Kichi Dube, Dungenam, Joe Sushi Barchedes, Rani Kwa Tome Maru Kunelani Bandulesa, then they allow Chuni Kunene, Neso da Kwa Kene Dumenyo Judi, Samtangura. Tini kaale chunga shite da gobe tab kaane bataya lebar kundu chibarchane kwa kuchu kandira kwa ndobe kyukare te yabushibas lamden da goten gijisigora ndobe shidu kyukane kwa gobe tabla 배구돼서 거에 주디까네 코아된 도그래서 나머지는 그 주단 게 매번 거 가는 게 요마라 그 주단 게데 매우 차나 그 뭐보다라시 매우 차라 주단 게데 대연하네 그 매우 소야게 요마도 매우 소통 말도 그래 주간에 거에 탑라 배구돼서 주 거에 주간에는 고안도에 탑라 배구돼 거에 동에 류를 천만 된 바다라 너무 그래서 거에 동에데 류를 천만 강발 천만을 수수는 수수는 기술된지 봐 육샤요라 근데지요 말와 그 레다 님명이 껴와 랑기거라 근데 그 주디가네 제부터 매와 속으로 맞아지 단다 요에다부터 봤더니 제 육샤지요 말해서 거라 그 동에 천만 된 봐서 천만하고라 강발 수용게
네.
천만을 받던데 수수는 디파트한테 꼬치 봐 육샤는 매우 잘라 근데 저는 그 매서 요 말해서 거라 또르치 미니베소세 오야 어디부터 질렀나
No.
마운트 조심해
So here in the English, there's a slightly different order to how they've put this book together. So we are going to be going to page 104. The section that comes from 91 to 104 comes at the end in Geshe-la's Tibetan text. So we will now be going to page 104, where it says how you enter into and then end cyclic existence. And so don't be sad, we will get to that section. It's just not coming right here. So, as it says, in the contemplation on how you enter into and end cyclic existence, you first contemplate how you pass through cyclic existence and then come to understand the basis or root from which birth and death and all the sufferings of cyclic existence arise. So we first begin by contemplating the stages of engaging in samsara. Like, how did I come to get here? What is the process by which I experience, say, the sufferings of the lower realms, all of the sufferings of any kind of cyclic existence? And by contemplating the kind of causes that lead to that, one then, it's continuing, once you understand the way to end the basis from which such sufferings arise, you strive to end cyclic existence by ending its causes. You cannot cast aside the sufferings of cyclic existence like you would remove a thorn from your flesh. So it's not as though, in the way that, like, if we are stuck by some sort of a thorn, we can just pull it out and no, we're done. We just got that thing out and we got rid of it. But rather, as Buddhists assert, there is no arising or ceasing of any phenomenon without causes. Everything occurs due to causes and conditions. And so in order to get out of cyclic existence, we have to understand the causes and apply the proper causes that will lead to that kind of cessation. So again, as if it were the case of if it were so easy as just sort of like removing a thorn, pulling something out, that would be quite different. But it is instead based upon particularly contemplating the kind of truth of cessation in the path, how we go about then disengaging in samsara is a causal process as well.
뭐야 리사 콜레스타 어디서 또 코아반남비 뒤둘러 롱주베 시험 땡데스 거라 뒤둘러 롱주베 시험 땡데 가르스나 로아르주 랑랑게 네지요레 르요레 롱주요레 때줄레 땡다 뒤두용 거라 냐와 땡두 잡시네 거라 네테 르도 롱주레 땡네 고 때와 동에 녀야지요레 미네 밀레 라이네 할레 메루 롱주레 서버테도 때저게 때와다 동에 께 시치거라 뒤둘러 롱주베 시데 로아 리투게스 라랑게 네시 대서치고라 잠불린 디레치라 류도 소소소류 롱주 사회동에 공연 내가서 봐 나조시 상에 나조시 여봐 데나 인신 대소대소 대단한 제월에 동해 숨지를 반영시 대소단 되네니 동해지 동해주에 동해 쳐반두시 동해에서 반영비 어디서라 기지진의 지도 용신시 기지진의 지도 교대 네 좋아하면서 걸어와 일하시네 좋아지게 야지네 시한테 야한테게 coercion, to coercion, Then Jungo be she say, Cushion, that condition in Gores. The two join the Kanga the condition in Gores. Then Jigden Chebabo Shandave, Devanashi, Tutamo Shanda, Devanashi, Jigden Chebabo Shore, David Kanga Suguores, then the Maresera, Cheba, to the Segura. Then Jungo, she say, Cuse, she am sour to the Carasana. Shende devatar chiso mare, chiso sede, samlo yo mare, bembo ye tutu tuwa yesigora. Ina koya miso da chiso lo koya de tuzi liya ko ketogu yesigora. Samlo yo bana shi kanka tungi yesigora. Chiso wade, keto hichu yesi changshen bawa devadira, chiriwe. Ya rangzhungi jikdengi chebabo, tangme ya takwa rangzhungi jikdengi chebabo, hadawa tinte yesi tiri, Gigaware, Shechira. There's a number killing your Marisera. Oh, gosh. Ranjungi Jignegi, Gobabo, Tangi, Kibula Soba, Tagan Tirso, Takba, Temba, Tirso, Koran, Tambu Nineko, Tende Tarchimba Yiba, Ganga Chetunge, Tendechi killing your number killing Marisera. They are Kongangi, Tibaduchi Labna.
So, here, for beings in cyclic existence, the basis for experiencing happiness or suffering is the various pleasant and fraught destinations, bodies, and resources for each of the 6 types of births. So when it comes to samsara, there is an abode, a kind of destination, a place that we are in, whether it's our a hell realm or our life as a human and whatnot. And then there is the body that we take on as such a being of a particular realm. And then there are the resources that we enjoy, food, drink, shelter, clothes, and so forth. And so all of these, in connection with these, then, beings experience any of the 3 types of suffering and continue to be born and die, cycling among the various realms of existence. So, based upon taking up a particular kind of existence within one of these realms, one experiences the 3 types of sufferings. The suffering of change or transformation, and the suffering of the pervasive suffering of conditioned existence. They are born, they die, they cycle into another rebirth, and so forth. This is the way in which beings cycle in samsara. Now, according to non-Buddhist systems, the cause, the root and basis from which this cyclic existence originates is the principal nature or a self-existent divine creator of the world, or the permanent and functioning being, and so forth. And so here, whether it is like a kind of creator, an all-powerful creator god, or some idea of like a primal substance, according to the Samkhya's, for example, there's this like materiality that is sort of the material of all of the world, but yet it leads to all of the various kinds of feelings of suffering and happiness and so forth. He's the source of all things. And then there are those that would assert that there's some kind of a divine creator, like an all-powerful creator that is able to make all of these various things. And all of these are unchanging, permanent, and enduring. So here, that's the kind of assertion of non-Buddhists. When it comes to this kind of understanding of non-Buddhist schools, what is the causation? What is the reason why we are in cyclic existence? They would assert that it is due to such a cause that is something that is permanent, enduring, and lasting, unchanging, permanent, and enduring, that leads to the rebirth within cyclic existence. So this is according to the non-Buddhist kind of schools.
Oh, yeah. 단지대 제바보 딱바 땜바 틀수바 된듯이 기기가 버쳐라. 대야 소소 Titu nyongengi kansa sosu kyo ngamata tendreta semki kyuten drewa kanya mayegechi. Takba tenba tirsuba jire cheba buchiyo na. Enta kowa ngarazu kowa kowarchi tayari mato cheyaka yo mari chera. Kyo takba de yoyo sonzani ngazu ti konzu kalchecheri mato sosoke yo mara. Chechen tindre yongu mari sikora. Kongengi kansa rangi ki simkyutan drewa kanya meba shile. Chunga yinani tetana kowa korshindu maoban, tata kowa nashi maoban na tinde korshi teo kukuri mato taraya tabshi yo mari chera. Karesane kowa korshungedi kyuti takba tenpa tirsuba chigi korshuguyo na. Korang kanje re mato ngansu cheyake yo mari chera. Takba kyundu nebe tu namya dokba mebe taja tele tarwa chi nigu mari se. Wati bodo chikyu na.
So there's just a little thing that we need to get through to finish this up for today. So here, if in connection with the former and latter moments of the mental continuum of a living being who is wandering in cyclic existence, this root cause is permanent and unchanging and remains without ceasing, then just as the living being is passing through cyclic existence now, he or she must pass through there also in the future without end. So here, if it were the case that there's some sort of like a permanent an unchanging, permanent, and enduring cause, whether that is a primal substance or whether it is an all-powerful kind of creator God, that is the reason that sentient beings are cycling in samsara, then if the cause is permanent, then there's no way that the kind of result can be impermanent. So in the future, just as we are cycling through cyclic existence now, and if the cause, the root cause, is this something that is permanent and unchanging and remains without ceasing, then just as we're cycling now, we're going to have to be cycling through future worlds without end. So how can one be liberated from that? As the cause cannot cease, it would likewise be impossible for the effect, cyclic existence, to cease. So if we were to follow after the kind of thinking of these non-Buddhist schools, then basically there is no method for liberation because the cause of this cyclic existence is something that is unchanging, permanent, and enduring. So we will stop there, pause there for today.
Again, we're so fortunate to have these teachings and commentary from you. And Katrina, thank you for making it possible.
Keranso sungcho nyaya di kewa sangores.
And hopefully we'll see everyone online again next Tuesday at 9 Pacific time. We'll finish with some dedications. Due to this merit, may we soon attain the awakened state of Guru Buddha, that we may be able to liberate all sentient beings from their suffering. May the precious Bodhi mind not yet born arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forever.